Hi, I'm Max.
I'm Gary.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Jack.
This is our podcast, and it's all about womanist reciprocity and appropriation in sports. Before we even start, we gotta define reciprocity and appropriation. Emily Towns is an African American Christian social ethics and theologian.
Yeah.
Anyway, she wrote a great book called Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. In chapter 2 of her book, she talks about reciprocity and appropriation. And she also talks about history and how history is one-sided. Additionally, how white men have made history books to represent themselves as good and not in the wrong. So we tend not to get the full story of what actually happened. It's kind of like how, let's say you're driving a car and you get in a car accident. Your account of what happened might be different from, or more exclusive, than a witness seeing the accident happen. This could be to protect yourself and get a better insurance settlement, or maybe not to go to jail. So overall, she asked for both sides of the story to be heard alongside with memory to get the full truth. So how does this relate to womanist reciprocity? Well, womanist reciprocity is asking for reciprocal privileges. Basically, it's asking for equality between everyone, including plants and animals. It also involves hearing both sides of a story along with history and developing a truth. Womanist reciprocity asks for reciprocal exchanges and privileges. So history is one of those privileges that should be reciprocated, so all voices are heard, along with sports. Many times sports do not give proper acknowledgement to women, but pay all attention to men's sports, which is not fair. And then how this relates to appropriation is appropriation is respecting what people have to say. For example, many first wave womanists do not agree with fourth wave womanists, but they still respect each other and their views. Another component of womanist appropriation is introducing more black women as significant to society. Womanist appropriation aims for introducing and developing black women to understand their significance and importance to all cultures. For example, if I were to ask a random person to name 5 influential and important black women in history, most cannot. Towns wants to introduce more women to history. Sports is a way that we can do that. And it'll make them more well-known, so history can be more inclusive and eventually produce more truth and ultimately understanding.
All right, so you guys just heard Max talk about the privileges of reciprocity. And like you said, one of those privileges is history. And so basically, the history of black women's sports is undocumented and pretty much unknown by majority of people. And so basically, I searched the web for the most influential athletes, and all the names that popped up were rather black men or white men. Names such as Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, Michael Phelps. I mean, names you're probably all familiar with. And I didn't know black female athletes popped up. And I bet for most people, it's honestly pretty tough to think of black female athletes that were influential to their respected sports. And yeah, so the stories of black females in sports have gone untold. Even though black women had to face discrimination and oppression in the strongest form simply to become relevant in sports. So this is exactly what Towns talks about in chapter 2. And it's that black women do not have a true history, and that history is one-sided. So in this scenario, it's with sports. So it's one-sided because all the history of sports is white men, black men, and there's nothing about white women. And even after, black women, and even after black women became prominent or relevant in sports, to say, even at that point, they weren't seen as equals or treated as equals in their respective sports. An example of that is in the 1910s, black women finally were able to play basketball at a competitive level. And the press would talk about them, but they would talk about them less about their skills and more about their looks, basically just treating them as sexual objects instead of athletes like they would treat their male counterparts. So just a little question I would ask for my partners. I said, what comes to mind when you think of a woman on the cover of Sports Illustrated?
Body issue.
Yeah, body issue.
It's definitely not sports related.
Yeah. So they all answered that it's the body issue, which is basically just girls in bikinis posing, and which doesn't really make sense for Sports Illustrated. When you see men on Sports Illustrated, they're just doing their sport and whatever. So basically, women have been sexualized in sports, and so yeah. And then this is an example of why womanist appropriation is important. Women need to be looked at as equal to their male counterparts in sports, and obviously in other aspects of society.
One sport that is very unfair is the U.S. Soccer team. The U.S. women national soccer team brought $5.2 million for the U.S., while the men's national team only brought less than $1 million. However, women get paid 1/4 of what the men get paid in the U.S. soccer team. And this doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's fair at all. So then I had to look into it. I had to think how many views they get, all that good stuff. But the women don't get a lot of views, and I don't know why that is. There's a lot of influential women in soccer, such as Marta. She's a Brazilian black woman who has played for her country 95 times, and during those 95 times has made 92 goals. That is almost unheard of. And then there's also Cindy Ray Larax. She's an Olympic gold medalist who has a net worth of $3 million. Well, an average man like Clint Dempsey has a net worth of more than $15 million. So what makes it so entertaining to watch a man versus the girls? I don't know. Maybe it's the fights, and male games are statistically a little bit faster as well. But so I had to look up some girl fights in the U.S. women's national team, and they're crazy. I don't know why we don't watch them. Like, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I don't know. Pretty wild.
Well,
Anyway, through a womanist perspective, we can see that America should be more equal to men and women in soccer through wage, and we should also learn about influential black women in soccer. But just sports in general, to become more fair to players. If I heard about Marta at a young age, I would have loved to watch her, and I would love to be informed. It would definitely spark my interest into soccer.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about women's basketball, and more specifically the WNBA. So the WNBA, like, their games are much less televised than even like college women's basketball. Like, if you guys can think about it, like, when was the last time you were like looking through channels and you just like stumbled on a WNBA game?
never.
Like, practically never. Yeah. And another issue is WNBA players receive 20% of the WNBA's total revenue, which is $11 million. The NBA players receive half of their total revenue, which is $3 billion. So there's a huge wage disparity right there. And like, it's not just women's basketball, it's specifically the WNBA in this situation, because international leagues are paying players to not play in the WNBA. They'll pay their whole salary that they would earn in the WNBA to just sit the offseason off, which I find is crazy. And what Jack was going off earlier, the like leagues looking at women as like sexual objects. Like, they're looking at getting tighter uniforms for like to earn more male viewership. And Brittany Griner was in an interview saying that like this was disgusting and completely against her morals. Like, she's there to play basketball, she's not there for male attention. And another thing, athletes aren't looked at as like their skill, they're looked at as like their appearance, their femininity, and their sexuality. And something I found crazy was people were talking about like the women's makeup in game, and I'm just like, when would you ever like talk about like a guy's like facial hair or acne or something like that? That just never comes up. Like, that's never something an NBA announcer like talks about.
And another sport that is very misrepresented is the U.S. women's hockey team. Many people might not know this, but they actually won the gold medal last year at the Olympics, and they beat Canada, which is like the predominant powerhouse of hockey. But prior to their Olympic run, they were on strike because they weren't getting paid like they wanted to. They were getting paid about $1,000 per month, and the USA hockey team only covered that for up to 6 months. So they're basically getting paid $6,000 for 4 years of work. However, they actually won their strike at the last minute. The Team USA decided to increase their wages. They make about $70,000 now, and it's just like it proves that we think of America as such a equal society, but at the same time, women are still being oppressed via wages. And also, the gold medal match was at 11 o'clock at night, and it wasn't even televised on NBC. It was on NBC Sports channel. However, was like the highest viewed event ever on that channel. And just back to the disparity between men and women, the U.S. Department of Labor publishes studies annually, and they said African American women as a group make 63% of what a white man would make. And this just shows that the playing field is not equal between men and women in sports and in other aspects of society. The women's hockey team is a champion, and we failed to realize it. So we should definitely treat them well.
All in all, I think we all agree that incorporating womenist appropriation in sports would help sports become more inclusive by learning about great female players in the past, such as Marta, and specifically black women. This would help engage people to watch female sports and create an equal playing field for all players. Women's wages would also increase because more people would be inclined to watch these sports, and womenist reciprocity would be achieved, if not very much helped upon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey guys, this is after the podcast. Gary and I thought it'd be really cool to show you guys like visuals of sports highlights of the sports that we were talking about during our podcast. And Gary, what'd you find?
When I looked up women's sports highlights, it was really hard to find like legitimate videos. Every video that came up, it was the hottest women in this sport, the most revealing videos of this sport. And it's just really objectifying. It just shows that like people aren't respecting women's sports. Like if you look at like the NBA, like we were talking about earlier, there's just so many like men's highlights, and there's very slim women's highlights.
Yeah, and another example of the not as many highlights was when we looked up U.S. women's hockey highlights. We only found a handful of examples and videos. And when I looked up the U.S. men's hockey team, and I found a plethora of results. And it just shows that women are treated as second-class athletes in comparison to men, and it's just not right.